Hello. Test, test. There it is. There's that Manitoba accent, hey? Good afternoon. Almost afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Carling. I am Métis from the Red River Treaty 1 territory here in what we now know as Canada. My family names are Morin, Cyr, Perot, Gruette, and that's an Indigenous way of introducing myself. And I'm going to pass it to the panelists to introduce themselves as well.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you hear it? My name is Christina Becker. I'm Associate Director in the U.S. Program, and I live on Duwamish land.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Alan Ngari. I am a Kenyan national of Kikuyu origin, and I am the Africa Advocacy Director. I'm based in our offices in Johannesburg.
Hello, everyone. I'm Maria Laura Canineu. I'm the Deputy Director for the Environment and Human Rights Division. I'm from Brazil, from the south of Brazil, the ancestral land of the Guaranis, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Chimigwech. So I'd like to start by asking everyone to take their shoes off. Just joking. Okay, thank you, Morgan, for knowing. Again. No, in all seriousness, though, I do want to thank everyone deeply for participating in the blanket exercise Monday, for those who were able to. I have been approached by so many people since, and it is incredible how this group really connected their hearts to their heads. And that is not an easy way to learn. It takes a great amount of bravery, especially for folks who are not as young as they used to be, to accept that kind of information in such a good way. And I just am so lifted by the reception that the exercise received. So Chimigwech for that. And thank you so much to Donna Slate for bringing that to all of you. When Donna said to me, "Can we do this?" And I said, "How many people?" And she said, "Maybe 300. And I said, "I don't know." But Donna was right, and it was just a really great way to start. And I'm honored to be back to help end. All right, now to the main program. So we just spent 3 days talking about the work that Human Rights Watch does, among many other things on environment, on economic justice, and increasingly on Indigenous rights. And in today's session, we're bringing all of these things together. So our three panelists, I'm asking you to please share a few words about the specific projects you're working on and explain to our audience how those three aspects come together in a way that has affected people's rights. Alan, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Thanks, Amanda. Really, it feels to me that we are doing a full circle. We started by discussing Indigenous people with an extremely wonderful blanket exercise, and here we are. We have this opportunity to share with you some of our work as it relates to Indigenous people, and I really have the pleasure of sharing with you some of our work related to the Maasai. Maasai are found in the Great Rift Valley in the east and central part of Africa. Some of you might have had an opportunity to travel there. It's really beautiful. There's fauna, there's flora. It's an amazing space. But in 2023, 2024, we did some work with the Maasai. And we found that the Tanzanian government specifically was removing them, forcibly displacing them from two specific areas, one called Loliondo and another called Ngorongoro. These are both in the Rift Valley, and these are places where the Maasai have lived for centuries. And the reasons why the government of Tanzania was moving these people is because of tourism, luxury tourism, and just to make extra money. So there was a lot of negotiations between the government of Tanzania and various other external partners. And I think this is where the responsibility of corporates comes in, and it's really a privilege to be able to work with colleagues around the organization that are looking at the questions of corporate responsibility. Because here we're actually seeing a link, a nexus between Indigenous rights, corporate responsibility, and accountability. And so the sorts of violations that we documented in 2023 included not just the actual forcible displacement, but the government was particularly hard on these Indigenous people, on the Maasai people. There were beatings, there were killings. They are a really organized group of people. They don't need any further agency. They themselves advocate for themselves, and they were able to coalesce around each other, and this is how we got information that their rights were being violated. So these really is the basis of the research that we did with the Maasai and the kind of violations that were meted out against them. And so our next question was, what do we do about this situation? And, we approached the government itself of Tanzania and informed them of these rights violations on the indigenous people. And the response that we got was quite interesting. One, it was that we are interested in developing this land. We want to ensure that there is economic stability in this region. And by moving these Maasai people from this area, then we're able to contribute to economic stability even for the Maasai themselves. And actually, they are at variance with the conservation model that, that the Tanzanian government was perpetuating. And I think that was a slap in the face of the Maasai, to tell them that this land that you have lived in for centuries, that you have coexisted with fauna and flora, that you have lived with the animals, is actually no longer a land that you can manage yourselves. And that's where a lot of the hard work then began, to try and change the thinking of the government of Tanzania on how to treat the indigenous people in Ngorongoro.
Should I go?
Maria,
or
yes, please. Maria,
Okay.
could you answer the same question?
Okay.
Tell us.
Were you wanting to go? No. Okay, so it's my turn.
Yes, please.
I'm so sorry. Yes, Brazil, that's what I'm going to speak about. I'm a Brazilian, and I was the head of the Brazil office for many years, where I started working on the issue of fighting the human rights violations coming from massive deforestation and environmental crimes. But before, as the Deputy Director of the Environment and Human Rights Division, I just want to remind everyone of the role that forests and play in the fight against climate change and global warming. As we know, forests are the carbon sinks, and they are important because they help to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that go to the atmosphere. And scientists over and over again tell us that the best way to protect forests is to demarcate land, indigenous land. Indigenous land are key to maintain the forest standing, and they are key to fight against climate change. So we have to remind that all the time, to just remember also it's a question of human rights, but indigenous rights, ancestral land rights, traditional occupation of this land, and it's also a question of being effective, strategic, and that is the narrative that we have been trying to use in Brazil over and over again. We started working on indigenous land rights in Brazil in 2019, when we had Jair Bolsonaro as our president. I think a lot of you guys remember that Bolsonaro was the first president elected in our young democracy on an anti-environmental agenda, anti-human rights agenda, anti-Amazon agenda, anti-indigenous rights agenda. And as soon as he got elected, yes, he did everything that he promised. He was starting dismantling all kinds of environmental protection. He practically attacked so much the role of our environmental agency that it was almost unable to effectively do its work. Deforestation went really, really high, and he pretty much ended the agency that protected indigenous rights. So in that context, we thought we should act and bring to the environmental world our methodology of investigating and documenting the human rights impact of all these environmental destructions. And the most immediate way to do that was to try to understand the issue of environmental defenders, indigenous people who had been trying to protect the forest in the context of Bolsonaro and had been increasingly killed, threatened, and really evicted from their lands. So we did a report trying to understand that, and we documented the ways in which criminal networks were not only destroying the environment, the government was giving a green light for them, and in addition to that, they were threatening and killing people, indigenous people included. From the 24 killings that we documented in 2019, most of them were against indigenous people in the Amazon region. Pará used to be the most dangerous place for environmental defenders in Brazil, and that's where we were working the most. Pará is one of the states in the Amazon region. It's the state which is going to host COP this year, which is very interesting. Many things were put in place to help on the issue, but not much more. So we did that work. We had a lot of, we had a change in government. We now have President Lula. Lula has one of the most influential environmental defenders as his Minister of the Environment. We have a really good relationship. We have been able to interact with the government, and many, many things were put in place in order to re-establish law enforcement in the Amazon, so deforestation went down. However, because of many other failures in state action, fires, criminal fires, are destroying many biomes in Brazil, including the Amazon. So our strategy now is not look so much like the violence is still key. Of course, this is the most immediate human face of the environmental destruction. But we thought we should go and check the root causes of this violence. And the root causes of this violence has to do with economic drivers of deforestation. Most of deforestation in the Amazon in Brazil is driven by cattle ranching. And the expansion of cattle in the Amazon is sad to see. So we have been visiting protected lands, including indigenous land, and trying to identify the presence of cattle, land grabbing, and the destruction of the Amazon in that sense. One of the places we have been going is the land of Cachoeira Seca. Cachoeira Seca is indigenous land, ancestral land of the Araras people. We got there after 2 days on a boat, and it's full of cattle. Like, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable to see. It's sad to see that you go on a boat, you take 2 days to go there, and this indigenous land is it's occupied by illegal logging, but also cattle ranchers. And they got there, and everybody knows that. And what we are trying to do is to highlight the case, because in this case, it's not only the livelihood, because indigenous people feel increasingly isolated in the community. They cannot go and they cannot hunt anymore freely. So it's the right to culture that is at stake right now, differently from the other human rights we had documented in the past. So the idea there is to continue to engage on this issue. There's lots that we have been documenting, violations of the rights of culture, violations of the right to memory, even, because one of the things that we have seen there is the difficulties of the elders to pass on information and knowledge to the younger people in the tribes, because they cannot go and show around what is happening in the forest. So, but also these places are places in which these indigenous leaders have been felt very threatened as well. So one of the ideas is also to engage with the issue that we have done in the past, which is when the state is not present, the indigenous people organize themselves to protect their land. And that's why they are the most effective guardians of the nature, because they know what is there. But of course, there is the need for the government to really promote eviction and remove these people. It's illegal. There is no question about the illegality of the presence of cattle being produced in this land, even when indigenous people are involved in the activity. So we need to talk about that, and that's what we are doing in Brazil.
Thank you, Maria. Christina?
Hi. Clearly we're seeing a theme here, right, of stripping of autonomy. And this story is no different. And I do want to tell a little story about the land first, and then how we got to this point, how HRW started to get involved. So a little bit about the area. In the high desert of Nevada, there is a mountain pass called Pihi-Maha, which is named by the Nuwu and Newe people. In English, it's called Thacker Pass. It's a place of austere beauty and also a place where a brutal massacre occurred. And this massacre was against the indigenous people. It's now, however, a site of an 18,000 square mile lithium mine that was fast-tracked by the Trump and Biden administrations. So this is the story of the Nuwu and Newe, who are fighting to protect these lands and their culture from a very large, powerful Canadian mining company who have their sights set on lithium deposits throughout the state of Nevada. So a little history. Between 1491 and 1890, the U.S. recorded a 95% decrease in the population of indigenous peoples. The 400-year span included multiple waves of European colonizers who had devastating effects on indigenous tribes. And I think we learned a lot about these devastating effects and cascading effects on Monday when we did the blanket ceremony. During that time period, the U.S. government tore tribes from their lands by putting them in reservations. They tore children from their families by putting them in residential schools, and then they severed them from any sort of financial autonomy over the very little land that they had left, which was only about 2% of the land that they originally had. So, and when they put them on these reservations, they thought they were tossing these tribes into barren lands, but what we learned over and over again is that was not the case. They found minerals and fossil fuels on reservations and forcibly extracted them. In 1872, the U.S. passed a law that allowed U.S. citizens and firms, and I want us to think about the word citizen because the indigenous people in the U.S. did not get citizenship until about 50 years after this law was passed. So this law permitted citizens and firms to claim minerals on any federally owned land, minus national parks, and prospect those minerals, to keep the minerals, and then they were not responsible for paying any royalties to landholders at all. That's crazy. A 2023 U.S. government report found that this law had transferred approximately 3.2 million acres to mining companies alone, representing an estimated amount of about $300 billion in mineral wealth. So this 1870 law is a codification of colonial extraction practices. And here's where we get to our story. Because it is this 1872 mining law that allows the mining of lithium on the ancestral lands of the Nuwu and Newe. Beyond the protection of medicinal plants and animals that they hunt, the tribes have another reason for challenging the mine. 7 years before the mining law, September 12, 1865, the 1st Nevada Cavalry Battalion of the United States Union Army entered their village. The cavalry approached their village in the early morning when everyone was still asleep and just started shooting. The massacre was brutal and extensive, and one of the perpetrators of the massacre, Jim Sackett, later recounted how soldiers killed small children, saying, "Make a cleanup, nits make lice." By the end of the massacre, the land called Pihi-Maha was strewn with blood and the bodies casually left to rot. The Numu, Nuwu, and Newe could not go back to retrieve the bodies or give them a proper burial because they risked further violence. So the land that they're protecting are the burial sites, informal burial sites of their ancestors. The settlers later named a portion of that land Thacker Pass, and that name is now shared with this open pit lithium mine that's currently under construction. I think a frightening prospect is that there are more than 23,490 exploration claims in just Nevada alone that we're presuming is for lithium mining. One of the spiritual leaders told HRW, "We thought the settlers would never disturb their own graves, and so you think that our graves would never be disturbed by them. As natives, we think this would never happen. People won't ever go and mine their own burial site, but they do. They treat us like we're an animal beneath them. They don't show us respect that we show them." So, between September and 2023 and January 2025, Human Rights Watch, along with ACLU, had the honor of sitting down with 41 Indigenous community members, interviewing them, and also interviewing journalists, lawyers, experts, and looking at materials such as scientific studies, maps, satellite imagery, to get an idea of how vast this mine would be and how it encroaches on the tribe's culture. What we found is that the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, an agency within the Department of Interior, which has legal jurisdiction over that land, when they approved the mine in 2021, the report stated that that the mining company and BLM had been in contact with the tribes throughout the permitting process, which sounds pretty good, right? We want informed consent here. Well, the extent of its direct contact with the tribes was merely 3 rounds of mailings sent to 3 out of 6 tribal governments in the area during the pandemic. And during the pandemic, the tribal offices closed because it devastated, the disease devastated the indigenous communities. So apart from those mailings, there was no follow-up at all from BLM. The mining company knows the law requires tribes to have a reasonable opportunity to identify concerns about historic properties, advise on identification and evaluation of historic properties, and participate in any resolutions of any adverse impacts that the mine could have. Of course, the law does not protect or mandate the resolution of adverse impacts, such as harm to people, flora, and fauna. And despite the opposition from at least 5 of the tribal governments, the Lithium Americas, the mine, move forward with construction. So while the mine is not displacing any of the communities, the construction work has prevented Numu, Nuwu, and Newe indigenous peoples from accessing parts of the Pihimaha for religious and cultural practices. Every year they hold a memorial at Sentinel Rock, which is sort of this rock that is large, jutting out of the land. They gather there to memorialize the dead. But now the mine itself creates physical obstacles, physical barriers. And the tribal residents express fear that they will be arrested, that they will be charged with trespassing if they try to get to the land.
So, Christina, can I jump in? Because we do have a few more questions. And I think one of the things that you said off the top was we see a theme developing here, and the theme is obviously corporate greed. And that is, this is an expression I heard as a kid that I didn't really understand until I started doing this work, was the more things change, the more things stay the same. And we see this common experience around the world of indigenous people being relocated. And we have teachings here on Turtle Island called different things, but often referred to as the 7 generations teachings. And we have to think about not just how what we're doing today impacts the people who are here today, but how do our actions and our decisions today impact our great, 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 great grandchildren. Yesterday in the keynote speech, Alan Rock talked about the 122 million forcibly displaced people that exist right now, and I think everyone in the room knows that that is a tragedy for those 122 million souls, those individuals who are suffering because they've been displaced from their land and territory. But as Indigenous people, because of that 7-generation teaching, and because we know that as Anishinaabe, as human beings, we have a responsibility not just to other humans, but to take care of the earth, to take care of the water, to take care of the four-leggeds and the winged ones and everything that exists in creation. As Indigenous people, we have special ways of caring for the land that we are accountable to. And I'm curious to know, in each of your countries, if you could name kind of one way that the Indigenous people in your country know how to take care of that land, to kind of illustrate for the group why this is a tragedy beyond just those human beings who are living right now. Maybe, Maria, you could start.
Yes, no, thank you for the question. And on that, I would go back to what I was saying, because this is a new finding of this new research that we are doing, which is the drastic change in the way of living when you start prohibiting, obstructing people to use their own land, right? In Cachoeira Seca, as I was saying, one of the ways in which they pass knowledge from elders to young people is through hunting. Hunting is not only a way to take their maintaining their livelihoods. It's a source of food, but it's also a source of way of teaching. So these Indigenous people and leaders told us that in the past they used to stay 5 days in the forest with their kids. And that was the way to show, like, this is how the environment works here. This tree you can use for getting nuts and food and selling in a sustainable way. These are the animals that we hunt. This is the dry season. This is the rainy season. This is what we do in the... So that, for me, is the most dramatic change, because this is being affected, obstructed, and they are very, very... afraid of the future in that way, but they are so resilient too. What we have been seeing is that they have tried to organize themselves to even divide themselves in different villages in order to occupy the territory. So then the cattle ranching that is happening there also cannot expand further. So they are finding their way. So that's it leads me to the thinking that it's very integral to our work at the Environment and Human Rights Division, which is the communities, the Indigenous peoples, they are the solution. And they are not part of the problem, they are the solution. And they come up with their own solutions. And that makes me think of also something that I brought but I didn't develop much, which is, it touched the corporate responsibility angle of our work. This cattle being grazed in Indigenous land is going somewhere, right? Like we know where is it going, and our work is showing that it's going to big slaughtering houses that are exporting these beef products and leather to Europe, and that's when. But of course, the Brazilian market is huge. The consumer market is huge in Brazil as well. 60% is consumed internally, but we are dealing and leveraging the EU legislation anti-deforestation in order to make a difference in the ground, and it's happening.
Oh my gosh. Christina?
I think part of what Maria Lauer said can be a line can be drawn to Indigenous people and their stewardship and protection of the land in the U.S. as well. They've studied the animals, the plants, the water in the region for hundreds of years. They know it best, and they know how things are interconnected. Their religious practices include protection of the land, not just to honor the land, but themselves as well. And I think of, this philosophy when you say, they think forward for 7 generations. And I think I see it in this quote from something an elder said to one of my HRW colleagues when he's talking about the mine, and he said, "The miner's blood is red just like ours. The white miners and their children will have to breathe the same polluted air as the native people living nearby." He pointed out another simple truth: you can't save Mother Earth by hurting her. And so I think he's not just thinking about 7 generations of indigenous people, he's thinking about 7 generations of people. And that is a different philosophy.
Yeah, for the Maasai people, I think the most difficult thing that they heard from the government was the audacity of government to say that your practices, your way of living is in contravention with the conservation model. And, you know, we spoke with the Maasai leaders themselves. We spoke with the women, we spoke with the children, and all of them said, we are not anti-conservation. We want to conserve the land, but we've been on this land for hundreds and hundreds of years. So you cannot come with a new model and tell us that what we are doing is actually in contravention to the protection of fauna and flora. And that, I think, is, again, on the question of corporate responsibility. So the companies that come and, you know, sort of dangle all these carrots for government, we need to call them out, because they're bringing in these new ways of thinking to governments in the interests of economic development, but they are at variance with the indigenous rights of the Maasai people specifically. So the movement of the people from this area, Loliondo, Ngorongoro, to Msomera, you must remember as well that this new area has people as well. There are others who are living in this land. So when you're forcibly displacing the Maasai from where they are to a different place, and there's a whole lot of consultations that need to happen. And here's where this indigenous right around free, prior, and informed consent was really violated by the Tanzanian government. We were very clear with the government that this is what you have failed to do. You, one, have insulted these people, that their way of living is not really in line with your modern ways of governance. But then at the same time, even with this international law that you're bound to, you have not followed it to the T. So these are some of the examples that we were demonstrating to the government. But on to your question specifically on what are these practices that the Maasai have had over the years. And I started off by talking about the Great Rift Valley and just how beautiful it is, and some of you might have had the opportunity of doing safaris. And, I have to plug in here as well that we work a lot on issues on reparations. This year is the African Union's year of reparations for Africans and people of African descent through reparatory justice, and it's steeped a lot in legacies of colonialism. And what we are actually seeing in happening to the Maasai and other indigenous groups is the legacy of colonialism. So this particular area, the Serengeti, where is very close to Loliondo and Ngorongoro, you know about the migration, and the wildebeest moved from the south, Serengeti, and they moved north to Kenya, to the Mara. So that's just how the animals move. And the Maasai have similar practices with their pastoralist way of life, that they also have grazing times and lands and move from one place to another. Those practices ensure that the land remains fertile, remains available for grazing as the different seasons go through. So this movement from Loliondo and Ngorongoro to a different place completely destabilizes the entire ecosystem. And you can actually see that in the scientific evidence, and I think Maria Laura did mention this, that there is scientific evidence to suggest that indigenous people know best how to protect and how to maintain their lands in comparison to state-run reserves.
Oh. There's so much hope for me as an Indigenous person in the fact that Human Rights Watch, through this research, is shining a light on how sophisticated the traditional knowledge is in these communities. I moved to British Columbia from here, and I was in Manitoba for a long time, and learned from the Squamish people that for generations they would watch the old growth forest and get to know each of the trees. And the elders would tell the young people when a tree was mature enough to harvest a 50-foot ocean-going canoe out of one cedar tree without harming the tree. They could take that whole canoe out of the tree and wrap the tree, and the tree would survive. And it wasn't, this is going to happen in my lifetime. It was, this is going to happen in several of your lifetimes. And having us understand the sophistication, for lack of a better word, gives me hope. I realize that all of your work is still ongoing, and we're very close to our Q&A. So I'm going to challenge each of you in 1 minute. What gives you hope? Christina.
I think what gives me hope is that I just think gaining knowledge usually gives me hope, because that's knowledge that can be shared with others so they can be informed and we could actually do something about it. And we have this report that came out that had a huge impact, got a lot of eyes on it, but there are so many more lithium mines that are on the horizon, and now we know now a lot of the tribes understand that they deserve and they require informed consent, and we can make sure that the future mines follow that protocol.
Oh, which?
Yeah, I'm recalling this time in October 2023, where the researcher who covers Tanzania and I were in Arusha, and it was a session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. There's a working group that deals with indigenous people, and we were trying to advocate with the Commission to write a letter of urgent appeal to the government of Tanzania to get the government to stop the forcible displacement of the people. And we organized a side event, and, again, going back to the blanket exercise, the sights that we were able to see around this room, the medicine and the sense that we were able to have as we were going through the exercise, it was a very similar thing for us in Arusha. The Maasai came in all their regalia. We had the Morans, tall as they are, with their red ochre hair. We had the old women with their shukas, the Maasai blankets, all colors, and they came in such great presence. I mentioned legacies of colonialism and constructs. When they came in for this event, they didn't have national IDs. I mean, when you go into meetings of intergovernmental organizations, you have to show some form of identification. But they knew who they were. I mean, you could see who they were. They came with who they were in their entirety. And, they were denied access into their rooms at first. And, our question to the organizers was, on what basis? I mean, you can see that these are the people that are coming to attend this event. Their identity is very clear. They are not a security hazard in any way. So that for me was a really powerful moment, but it was when they started speaking to the commissioners of the African Commission. It was the passion in which they expressed themselves, talking about the years and years that they and their ancestors have been using the land, have been enjoying the land. At that time, actually, the government of Tanzania had stopped certain services, food, healthcare services, education, in some of the villages where these Maasai were living. And they were pleading to them, you need to bring this back. And fortunately, the government of Tanzania did hear this pressure. Those are some of the things that give me hope that we actually are making some difference. And so the forcible transfers have been halted at this time.
I love just making it awkward until you get your way. That's beautiful. Thank you.
Oh, it's so hard. 1 minute is very unfair, but I will try. And I have a photo, which it might not sound so hopeful, but it is. Is it ready?
Cue the photo.
Cue the photo. Okay, no, but it's a very important one. So first, reminds me to say that, as I said, our work in the Amazon has proven that it's about indigenous people, but it's much more than that. We have Afro-descendant communities, Quilombola, doing a lot to protect their lands. We have lots of small farmers trying to strike the balance between social sustainability activities, but also protecting the forest. And this is, let's call her Maria. Maria is a forest defender in the middle of Lake de Pará, where the forest was almost completely destroyed because of the occupation of illegal loggers and cattle ranchers. And she is under the protection of the National Human Rights Defenders Protection Program. And she, in her community, already in the last 5 years, 5 people were killed because they stood against the illegal loggers, and they when they started investigating themselves, they were killed. And she is the one of the few who survived, and she is doing the work until now. Like, she doesn't give up. So it gives me hope to remember every day that Maria is in the middle of the forest trying to protect her land. And the reason I showed this photo is because when she was, at the times that she was not very hopeful during the Bolsonaro administration, she decided to tattoo the face of her son on her chest because she was afraid that if she was killed, she would be identified, not as an unknown person, but people would know who she is. So, but the good news is that as soon as the government changed, we were able to send our report about Terra Nossa, which is a settlement where she lives, to the new government, and this new government decided to make Terra Nossa one of the priorities of the operation, federal police operation, to evict people from her land. So ever since we've been in touch, she's more hopeful. Of course, there is a long way because the forest is completely destroyed there. So now we have to offer her opportunities to develop. But she's there. She doesn't give up. And that gives me hope and a sign that I cannot give up. If she's there, I cannot not have hopes that we can have a better sustainable planet and Brazil forest.
Good question. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. And I don't know who's going to bring you a mic, but I feel like someone will bring a mic. Wonderful.
For those of you who've been to Arles, we watched this movie, The Territory, which was mind-blowing and also heartbreaking because you saw the situation. And it's a story about indigenous people who have their area within the Amazon forest, and all settlers and people come in. And you feel this is like Turtle Island or North America 1860. And you believe, oh gosh, this is terrible. I believe there is some hope and difference between the world back then, because there are laws. And when I heard about it's about informed consent, there are laws. That's the difference to the time back then. Nevertheless, there is one observation that I think is so difficult when dealing on these topics, that you don't enter into some form of being paternalistic and saying we have the idea and we like the way you live and treat the land, while indigenous people, depending on where they are, cannot live without the world around them. So there is an interest in growth, and there is an interest in having even earn money. And what we, for example, this is not an indigenous people, but this situation is the same. If you look at Mongolia, they were nomads, and they live in their yurts. But since they have access to the global market, they have more goat than the grass can take. So they have a problem with the grass and the overpopulation of goat. And I think it's so hard to really work on these issues because they're hyper-complex. That was more a comment than a question, but I apologize.
Panelists, does someone want to respond?
Yeah, I see your point, and I think it's difficult to be balanced on how we approach, because in Brazil, indigenous movement is historical, strong, active, resistant, resilient. Of course, they have been under extreme attack on even the right to occupy the traditional land by not only the previous administration, but even the current administration, because it's hard. Like we want to develop and we want to demarcate more land. And there is a decision from the Congress of Brazil to say that you can only demarcate land if you prove that you were there at the time of the Constitution, that Constitution was enacted. And that is we call the marco temporal, the cutoff date, which is a horrible attack on the right to be traditionally occupying your territory, and to the idea that they were expelled. They cannot prove they were there because they were expelled from the land. And this is coming even in a more progressive environment in Brazil, and that is the most horrible attack that they could ever have. So what we do is like respect their own path. We work together. Like at the time during Bolsonaro administration, it's a really good story because we were pressing for the pressure to come from abroad in terms of putting in place mechanisms to protect the forest. And at the time, I wrote an op-ed with the now Minister of Indigenous Peoples' Rights. She was appointed recently, but at the time she was one of the most brave forest defenders in Brazil, and we wrote together an article for a foreign audience, and that I wouldn't do it right now because now the government is against any interference from before. But it was like when balancing, when you do things together, when I think the pressure was so huge in the previous administration that they were calling us to give and help on access. So it's a balance, but I see your point and I agree completely. You have to be careful on your approach.
Yeah, I would just add from the Canadian perspective as well, we gave a list of books for further reading with the maps, and one of the books is called Inconvenient Indian. And the reality is, we are complex. There's no one opinion amongst Indigenous people. Indigenous people are colonized. Some of them really internalize colonization more than anything. And Indigenous politics are just as messy and just as complicated as non-Indigenous politics. So I think, we have to be patient. We have to make sure that Indigenous people have the resources to come together to debate how their laws have to develop and evolve, where economic development is appropriate and where protection of the environment is appropriate. But if there's one thing maybe we can be sure of, it's that whatever the consensus that is reached eventually there is probably better for the next 7 generations than in the non-Indigenous government. Do we have another question? Oh.
To turn it on or no? Sorry, so my question, I guess, is about cultural rights, and not for anyone in particular in the panel, but I worry about the way that human rights activism is destroying Indigenous cultures and the impact it's going to have on climate and culture. For example, my work in the subarctic and the Arctic, the Inuit people don't like sending their kids to school because school, and once kids are finished school, then if they go to any post-secondary school, the distance from Tuktoyaktuk to Edmonton is the same distance as from Greece to Denmark. These are big, and these are very isolated communities where the kids go and they get educated, and education means that they get capitalist values, they see Amazon, and then they don't want to return to these communities that offer them nothing. There's no jobs, there's no traditional ways of life. And similarly in Northern Ontario, where we have lots of reserves that are very tiny, I work and drive in communities that people have to drive 18 hours in the winter on ice just to go to Thunder Bay to buy groceries, and they'll return home. So when we start educating and we put our Western values, like the problem with I'm struggling with is we are colonizing people by educating people. We are colonizing people by putting them in our school systems and transmitting our values, and then the conversations, as you're talking about, people don't think of 7 generations anymore. They think of how to get new cabinets from IKEA and all the other things that everyone else does who's Westernized. And I just worry about how the impact of human rights advocacy is actually destroying Indigenous culture because we're we still value education. We still value liberal individualist values of, we don't value multi-generational homes. We don't value all those things. And I'm wondering how you guys struggle to not destroy the cultures you're trying to help.
Yeah, I'm very happy to come in. It's a really good point you raise, and I thought of this one young man that we worked with a lot, especially for the event that I described in October 2023 in Arusha. He's an advocate of the High Court of Tanzania. His name is Ole Ngurumwe, and he is Maasai, and he came in dressed in, the full traditional outfit. He was jumping up and down with the Morans, yet he is a full advocate of the High Court. So what I see there is that, the tools that he is using now, even in his advocacy, and I must also mention that for advocacy, as we work with these communities, we always say that we don't speak on their behalf because they're so organized. They're such a group that they know exactly what they want and where to get what they want. We just accompany their voices. And so I saw that these people are ingrained in all ways of life as we know it, but they've still maintained their traditional values. They have still maintained their roots, their origins, and all that. So I think it is worth it for us to advocate for governments to continue providing education because every person in the country has the right to good quality education, provide the health services, but also allow them to practice their own cultural and traditional practices that really make them who they are. So that's the experience that I can share, at least with the Maasai that I saw.
And I have this overwhelming feeling of wanting to continue to talk about this, but unfortunately we are out of time, which gives me great hope. Obviously, after 2.5 days, we've only begun to skim the surface of all of the things that we could discuss together. I'm going to ask you to please stay in your seats, but first, thank the panel, not only for today, but for their work.